the Green Beret who went on a one-man rampage, Roy Benavidez, the Vietnam War. Roy Benavidez's life had been rough as a child. Both his parents had died. He was bullied by his classmates because of his mixed Yaqui Indian and Mexican heritage and had to leave school in 8th grade to help his family. At the age of 19, Benavidez joined the Army, serving in the Korean War in the Texas Army National Guard. He married Hilaria Lala Coy Benavidez in 1959 and completed airborne training, becoming assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. In 1966, Sergeant Roy Benavidez was in hospital after stepping on a landmine. Doctors said he would never walk again. He had been sent to Vietnam in 1965 as an advisor for the ARVN troops there. Benavidez was carrying out a classified operation alone to gather evidence that the North Vietnamese troops were posing as Viet Cong. While he was on patrol along a narrow trail disguised as a Viet Cong guerrilla, he stepped on a landmine. Sometime later, a squad of Marines came across Benavidez. They initially thought it was a booby trap, but were surprised when they flipped him over and discovered the man in Viet Cong pajamas was Hispanic and wearing U.S. Army dog tags. He was soon evacuated to the hospital. In hospital in the U.S. 2 months later, Benavidez had recovered and awoke. His memories came back to him. The doctor told him he would never walk again. His spine had been damaged and his brain had rattled in his skull. Nevertheless, Benavidez, sitting in his wheelchair, begged the doctors not to discharge him from the Army. The Army was his life. Determined, Benavidez got up from his bed night after night, dragging himself to the wall and putting weight on his legs. For weeks, he pushed through the pain, going further in distance than before, which surprised the doctors. 6 months later, with his wife Lala's support, Roy Benavidez walked out of the hospital. He was promised only a desk job at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, but determined and exercising every day, he trained vigorously and qualified for the Special Forces, also known as the Green Berets. He would be assigned to Detachment B-56, 5th Special Forces Group Airborne, 1st Special Forces. 6 hours in hell. Now it was 1968. Staff Sergeant Roy Benavidez, now with the code name Tango Mike Mike, was back in Vietnam and was off-duty attending church, but his mind was fixed on the panicking radio chatter from the front lines. In Loc Ninh, Vietnam, near the Cambodian border, a 12-man Special Forces reconnaissance team, which included his close friends, Sergeant First Class Leroy Wright, Staff Sergeant Lloyd Frenchie Mousseau, Specialist 4 Brian O'Connor, and 9 Montagnard tribesmen who were part of the Civilian Irregular Defense Group Program, or CIDG, were surrounded by a battalion numbering 1,000 battle-hardened North Vietnamese soldiers. Everyone in the unit had been wounded or killed in earlier fighting, and 3 of the helicopters sent to rescue them had been unable to extract them due to heavy enemy fire. When the helicopters returned, they were riddled with bullets. One of them, the door gunner, Michael Craig, age 19, had been hit several times and died in Benavidez's arms. There was no way Benavidez was going to leave his friends out in the jungle. Benavidez jumped onto a returning helicopter that was going back in, volunteering so quickly that he didn't have time to get his M16, so was only armed with a Bowie knife and medical supplies. Benavidez described it as going into autopilot. As he was approaching the extraction zone, Benavidez realized his fellow team members were too severely wounded to run the distance to the helicopter. There was so much enemy gunfire that the pilot, Larry McKibben, had to zigzag in an attempt to dodge it, but was nevertheless able to provide covering fire. Benavidez jumped out with a medical bag and ran through the jungle to the wounded men under heavy enemy fire, taking a shot to the leg, which he initially thought was a thorn bush. He found Mousseau first against a tree whose eyeball had been shot out and was hanging down his cheek, but was determined to keep shooting back. The CIDG were in a pool of blood and patched up as best they could. Benavidez dragged everyone into a defensible position to direct their fire at the enemy and provided morphine to the wounded. He then saw O'Connor and an interpreter CIDG who he motioned to move over to him, but the gunfire started again and they took cover. Another round then hit Benavidez in his thigh. On adrenaline, he popped the green smoke for McKibben in the rescue helicopter to pick them up. While everyone who could move got into the chopper, he suppressed the tree line with an AK-47 he had picked up to cover O'Connor and the interpreter who crawled towards the helicopter. Now Benavidez was looking for the team leader, Sergeant First Class Leroy Wright, who had been killed and who also had intel on him that could not get into enemy hands. Benavidez found his body and proceeded to drag him to the chopper when he was shot again, this time in the stomach and hit in the back by shrapnel from a nearby grenade, knocking him out. When he awoke, Benavidez was forced to leave his dead friend's body. Disaster had also struck. The chopper had crashed to the ground from enemy fire. The pilot, McKibben, was dead. 5 of the men on board, including Mousseau, survived the crash, as did O'Connor and the interpreter who didn't get into the helicopter. Benavidez pulled them out of the wreckage, dispensed morphine, set up a perimeter around the crash site, and called in heavy air support from the F-100s above, which dropped napalm on the enemy position. When the jets ran out of fuel and had to leave, the enemy machine gun fire started again. Benavidez gave O'Connor a 3rd shot of morphine and took another bullet to the leg. Their position was surrounded by North Vietnamese soldiers. It looked hopeless. But a helicopter finally came to their rescue. Benavidez and the rescue team carried and dragged the wounded men onto the chopper, but the landing zone was still being fired upon by NVA troops, to the extent that 2 men were shot in the back as they crawled to it. Shrapnel wounds to his face from earlier caused Benavidez's vision to be blurred from the blood in his eyes. When he went to get Mousseau, an NVA soldier butted his rifle into Benavidez's head and jaw and slashed his arm with his bayonet. He shouted to O'Connor to shoot, but he was too drugged from morphine to react. Benavidez pulled out his Bowie knife and stabbed the NVA soldier till he was dead. He then dragged Mousseau to the helicopter and killed 2 more NVA with an AK-47 who were out of the helicopter's side gunner's arc of fire. And then he made one more trip to get the interpreter and destroy any classified material, with blood still obscuring his vision. Only then did he allow the others to pull him onto the helicopter, the last man to leave the battlefield. At this point, the round that had hit his stomach had exposed his intestines, which he was trying to hold in with his hands. The helicopter, badly shot up and with no instruments left, managed to take off. When they landed, the wounded were unloaded and examined one by one. It had turned out that Benavidez had even loaded 3 dead enemy soldiers into the helicopter in case they had classified materials. They were left to the side, as was Benavidez. He couldn't move or speak because of the broken jaw from the rifle butt. The blood over his eyes had glued them shut, and with 37 bayonet, bullet, and shrapnel wounds all over his body, he looked dead. Medics started placing him in a body bag and started zipping him up when a friend noticed him and said, "That's Roy Benavidez." The doctor said there was nothing that could be done, but Benavidez mustered his last bit of energy and spat in the doctor's face, causing the doctor to say, "I think he'll make it." He was flown to Japan for intensive surgery, then Brooke Army Medical Center, Fort Sam Houston, where he stayed for almost a year. Roy Benavidez had survived 6 hours in hell and saved 8 lives. Benavidez's commander had put him in for the Distinguished Service Cross because the process for awarding a Medal of Honor would take much longer, and he was unsure if Benavidez would live or die before he could have received it. Finally, on February 24, 1981, President Ronald Reagan would present Roy Benavidez the Medal of Honor. Reagan said, "If the story of his heroism were a movie script, you would not believe it." Benavidez said of his actions, "The real heroes are the ones who gave their lives for their country. I don't like to be called a hero. I just did what I was trained to do." Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez died on November 29, 1998, at the age of 63. Mad Jack, the man who fought with a longbow and a sword in World War II. John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill was born in Hong Kong and graduated from the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst in 1926. He would later earn the nickname Mad Jack or Fighting Jack for fighting with a longbow, bagpipes, and a sword in World War II. Stationed at Burma with the Manchester Regiment in the British Army during peacetime made Mad Jack restless. It was during the interwar years, in the 30s, that he would master the bagpipes and ride his motorcycle across the entire Indian subcontinent. In 1936, after moving to England, Mad Jack left the army and became a model and a movie extra. He would also practice a new skill, archery, and became so good that he represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in 1939. When war arrived, Mad Jack returned to the British Army and the Manchester Regiment as an officer and was shipped off to France. During the Battle of France in 1940, Mad Jack led small raids on the enemy as the British Expeditionary Force was on the retreat from the Germans' relentless advance. Using a longbow and a Scottish broadsword as his weapon of choice, he became the only soldier known to have felled an enemy with a longbow in the war when he landed a shot on the enemy Feldwebel with a barbed arrow. When asked why he did this, he replied, "Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." During the retreat to Dunkirk, Mad Jack was shot in the neck. When asked how it happened, he replied, "German machine gun," casually. He would also win the Military Cross for bravery after rescuing a wounded British officer from a German ambush. After Dunkirk, Mad Jack signed up for the Commandos, and when his training was complete, he was sent to Vagsø, Norway in 1941 as second-in-command of No. 3 Commando in Operation Archery. As he left the landing craft, Mad Jack played March of the Cameron Men on his bagpipes and then led his men ashore with his broadsword waving in the air. The German garrison at Vagsø was quickly defeated. Prisoners were taken and the artillery batteries captured, along with shipping destroyed on Malloy Island. For this action, Mad Jack received his second Military Cross. In 1943, in Italy, Mad Jack led 2 Commando with the objective to destroy German artillery and observation posts in the town of Piglioletti. Even though the town was well defended and outnumbered, Mad Jack organized his men into 6 parallel columns, who instead of using stealth tactics all shouted "Commando!" The German defenders, as a result, were confused into thinking the shouting, which was coming from all directions in the darkness, was a much bigger force. In this skirmish, the 50 men of No. 2 Commando took 136 prisoners. Mad Jack, who was assisted by Corporal Raffel, took 42 German prisoners and captured a mortar crew using his broadsword. After marching the prisoners down to British lines, he said, "I maintain that as long as you tell a German loudly and clearly what to do, if you are senior to him, he will cry 'Jawohl' and get on with it enthusiastically and efficiently, whatever the situation." After losing the broadsword in hand-to-hand combat earlier, he later went to the town on his own to retrieve it. On the way, he met an American patrol going towards the enemy lines when they should have been going the other way, so he told them that he wouldn't come back for a bloody third time. In 1944, Mad Jack was in Yugoslavia leading British commandos and now Yugoslav partisans, attacking the vital hill called Point 622 on the island of Brac in the Adriatic Sea against the Germans. Heavy casualties were caused, and soon Jack was alone and out of ammo. With no hope left, Jack started playing songs on his bagpipes until he was knocked unconscious by a frag grenade and captured by the German defenders. He was first sent to Berlin and interrogated, as it was thought that because of his real name, he was a relative of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and afterwards sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. But in September 1944, Mad Jack and an RAF officer escaped the camp by crawling under barbed wire through an abandoned drain and set out to walk to the Baltic coast, but were then captured. Now sent to a new camp in Niederdorf, Austria, Mad Jack escaped again on April 1945, taking the opportunity to get away when the lighting system failed in the darkness of night. He walked 150 miles through the treacherous terrain of the Alps, surviving on vegetables that he had liberated from gardens. 8 days later, and with a sprained ankle, he found a U.S. armored column and was sent back to England. Jack was frustrated that the war in Europe was all but over, so made his way to the Pacific Campaign to join the battle against the Japanese in Burma. But by the time he arrived, the atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mad Jack was so unhappy, he said, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. After the war, Mad Jack continued to seek danger, qualifying as a parachutist, then transferring to the Seaforth Highlanders, and later ending up in Palestine in 1948 as second-in-command of 1st Battalion, the Highland Light Infantry. During an ambush on a Jewish medical convoy by Arab forces, Mad Jack, with only 12 men and in full military dress, marched under fire to the convoy to offer its evacuation. "I grinned like mad from side to side," he said afterwards, "as people are less likely to shoot at you if you smile at them." He would later coordinate the evacuation of 700 Jewish doctors, students, and patients from the hospital atop Jerusalem's Mount Scopus. Mad Jack would retire from the Army in 1959 with 2 awards of the Distinguished Service Order. the Gurkha who took on 200 soldiers with only one hand. 1945, World War II. From mid-1944, the tides of war were changing for the Japanese army in Burma. Commanded by General Sir William Slim, Chindik guerrillas, American troops and Chinese troops forced the Japanese forces into a state of constant retreat. For almost a year, fighting continued across the boundless jungles of Burma. One unit that saw a lot of action in Burma was the 4th Battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles. They were part of the 89th Indian Brigade who were ordered in the spring of 1945 to make a maneuver across the Irrawaddy River to cut the route of the Japanese forces towards Taungda. As always, the Gurkhas were the first in. It was May 12, 1945 when the 4th Battalion arrived at the village of Taungda and established camp. As most of the unit fell asleep, small forward positions were established to protect the camp from surprise attacks. During the night, 200 Japanese soldiers decided to surprise the Gurkhas and to break their way towards Taungda. The first line of defense they encountered was a small trench manned by Lakhaman Gurung and 2 other soldiers. This trench was positioned on the jungle road that led straight to the camp. If Gurung's position was overrun, the entire camp would have been endangered. At 1:20 a.m., Japanese grenades started to fall on Gurung's trench. Gurung managed to grab the first bomb that fell in the trench and threw it back. He did the same with the second, but was too late for the third. It dropped right in front of the trench, and as Gurung lunged to grab it, it exploded right in his hand when he tried to throw it back. His right hand was severely damaged. Fingers were blown off and his entire hand was shattered. Burning shrapnel pounded his face, body, and right leg. 2 other soldiers were also badly wounded and put completely out of action. But not Gurung. He took out his kukuri knife, stuck it in front of his trench, and yelled at the enemy, promising them that not one of them would pass by his knife. Without his right hand and bleeding all over the place, Gurung continued to fight. He took his bolt-action Lee Enfield and started to shoot at Japanese soldiers who were trying to rush the position. They were welcomed by the now one-handed Gurung, who yelled, "Come and fight a Gurkha!" Using only his left hand to reload and fire a rifle, Gurung was waiting for every single Japanese soldier that approached his trench to shoot them. For 4 entire hours, Gurung was holding his position alone, killing every enemy soldier that came close to him. As he saw it, he was about to die anyway, so he decided to go out with a fight. Being a Gurkha, backing down was not an option. Early in the morning, his comrades relieved Gurung, who had lost a lot of blood. 31 Japanese soldiers lay dead in front of his spot. His efforts inspired other soldiers to hold off waves of Japanese attacks for another 2 nights and 3 days. For his gallantry, Lakhaman Gurung was awarded with the Victoria Cross by the Viceroy of India, Lord Louis Mountbatten, at a parade at the Red Fort in Delhi on December 19, 1945. Lakhaman Gurung's actions in combat were an example of the bravery and commitment Gurkhas demonstrated during the Second World War. Even though he had lost his sight in his right eye and lost his right hand, Gurung would continue to serve with the 8th Gurkhas. After completing his service in 1947, he returned to his village in Nepal to become a farmer. On December 12, 2010, Lakhaman Gurung died at the age of 92. The pilot who shot down a plane with a pistol while parachuting. On March 31, 1943, 12 B-24 Liberator bombers of the U.S. 7th Bombardment Group were deployed from their base in Pendaveswar, India, to bomb a bridge in Pyonmana, Burma. This was not an unusual mission for the 7th Bombardment Group, as they regularly flew missions aimed at disrupting Japanese supply chains in Burma. When on the way there, they were suddenly intercepted by 13 Japanese Ki-43 Peregrine Falcon fighters who mercilessly tore into the American bomber formation. One of the B-24s was badly hit and caught on fire, forcing the crew to bail out moments before the bomber exploded. As the crew parachuted downward to Earth, the attacking Japanese planes started to strafe the defenseless Americans, killing 2 of them. One of the crew parachuting downwards under a hail of enemy fire was the co-pilot of the bomber, Second Lieutenant Owen J. Baggett, who was hit and slightly wounded in his arm. The injured Baggett landed on the ground, and along with a fellow crew member, he took cover in the trees as the Japanese aircraft started to strafe them. Later that day, they were captured by Japanese forces, and Baggett spent the next 2 years in a prisoner of war camp, first in Rangoon and then in Singapore. This we can all take as fact, as there is official paperwork and witness statements to back this all up. But what happened during Lieutenant Baggett's descent down to the ground is something we only have his word for. As Baggett descended downward by parachute, he was hit in the arm as the Japanese planes mercilessly attacked him and his fellow crew members. Baggett decided to play dead, hoping to fool the enemy fighters into leaving him alone. A Japanese pilot then slowed down at around 4,000 feet with its canopy open and approached Baggett, who was hanging limply. Baggett took the opportunity to draw his service M1911A1 automatic pistol and, in anger, fired 4 times at the exposed Japanese pilot. Moments later, the enemy plane seemed to stall and spiral downwards. But in all the mayhem, Baggett didn't see what finally happened to it. Baggett claimed he had not known that he had supposedly shot down the aircraft until some time later, when a U.S. Colonel Harry Melton passed through the POW camp he was being held at. Melton explained that a Japanese intelligence officer had told him that on that day Baggett was shot down, a Ki-43 from the engagement had crashed and burned, but the dead pilot had been thrown clear of his plane. On examination of the body, it had been found that the pilot had been killed by a single bullet wound. Baggett said Colonel Melton had intended to make an official report of the incident, but there is no record he ever did. This could be easily explained away by the fact that later Melton was on a Japanese transport ship being transferred to Japan when it was torpedoed and sunk on September 12, 1944 by USS Sea Lion, an American submarine. 2 days later, while adrift on a lifeboat, he and other survivors were machine gunned down by a Japanese destroyer. There is no record or other witnesses to Baggett and Melton meeting, but it was probable as they were both in the Singapore POW camp at the same time. But if it was not Baggett who didn't shoot down the Japanese aircraft, then who did? As there were no Allied fighters in that area that day. No one seemed to consider it could have been from friendly fire, possibly from the overexcited other Japanese aircraft that were trying to hit Baggett's parachuting crew members. The story goes that the Japanese colonel was adamant that this was the pilot Owen Baggett had fired at, but no explanation was given as to how he knew this. There have been some discrepancies in the retelling of the story over the years, but they have been minor and they don't really distract from the overall story. Some had stated Baggett used a revolver and not a semi-automatic, while others claimed he was a first lieutenant and not a second lieutenant. And the most common discrepancy was it was often claimed that he was attacked by Mitsubishi A6M0s and not Nakajima Ki-43 fighters that were in the area at the same time. This could be easily explained away as both aircraft looked very similar and the Ki-43 was often mistaken for being a Zero by American pilots. The dead body of the Japanese pilot being thrown clear of his crashed aircraft could have happened, but sounds a bit far-fetched and convenient. Could it be possible that the pilot had circled Baggett and simply stalled? Again possible, but unlikely as the Ki-43 had an exceptionally low stall speed when compared to other fighters. It was around 72 miles an hour as opposed to the P-51D Mustang, which was 100 miles per hour. Also, the Ki-43 was seen spiraling downwards either out of control or having stalled. If it had stalled between 4,000 to 5,000 feet, standard flight school training procedure teaches pilots how to recover from a stall, as long as you still have 3,000 feet of altitude. Would the canopy have been open? Even discounting the theory that the canopy was open for the pilot to take a better look at Baggett's supposedly dead body floating downwards, pilots often had their canopy open for a number of reasons, such as to aid navigation or to allow for quick bailout in battle. It could also get uncomfortably hot inside the canopy, especially in the Pacific theater of war. The firearm Baggett was said to use was the Colt M1911A1, which was the standard personal defense weapon carried by U.S. officers at the time. It fired the powerful .45 caliber, and the weapon magazine carried 7 rounds. It was semi-automatic, so it could fire rapidly. If the plane came straight on, it may have been possible for Baggett to accurately hit the pilot, but if it came in at another angle, it would be far harder, if not impossible. So, has it ever happened before? There were accounts during the opening stages of World War I of pilots exchanging fire at one another with handheld pistols and rifles. On April 25, 1945, right at the end of the war in Europe, there was an encounter between two unarmed reconnaissance planes, a German Fi-156 Stork and an American L-4 Grasshopper, and was one of the very last dogfights of the war on the Western Front. As the L-4 was unarmed, the pilot and co-pilots opened-fired with their Service 45 semi-automatics at the German aircraft, injuring one of the German crew members and forcing them to land and be captured. So what did really happen on that fateful day on March 31, 1943? Did Baggett fire off a lucky shot and down an enemy fighter? Was all the evidence of this remarkable event lost in the chaos of war? Or was it simply a tall story embellished and turned into an urban legend after countless retelling by the media? Leo Major, the one-eyed scout who liberated a whole town by himself. World War II. In World War II, for the Canadian effort, one soldier stands out from all the rest: Leo Major. He was a French-Canadian from Montreal, Canada. In 1940, at the age of 19, he joined the Le Régiment de la Chaudière of the Canadian Army. Their insignia underlines their fierce fighting reputation, consisting of two crossed Vickers machine guns with a beaver above supporting fleur-de-lis. Private Leo Major first saw action at D-Day in France, taking part in the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944. Straight away, he distinguished himself as a scout behind enemy lines by capturing a German communications half-track full of secret code books. He then forced the captured crew to drive the Hanomag towards friendly lines, but was fired upon with anti-tank guns by British and Canadian troops. Leo had to climb on top of the vehicle to get them to stop firing as they drove closer, and later remarked how happy he was that the British and Canadian soldiers didn't know how to shoot. When the English officer asked Leo to hand over the Hanomag, Leo refused outright, stating that it was a Quebec man who captured it, and so it was handed over to the Chaudière Regiment. His war was nearly cut short when a few days later he was scouting ahead of his unit. Leo unexpectedly encountered a patrolling elite Waffen-SS unit. In the ensuing firefight, he managed to kill 4 of the enemy soldiers, but one of them, fatally wounded, managed to throw a phosphorus grenade, and Leo was hit, damaging his left eye badly. Leo was then sent to a field hospital for treatment. Leo had to wear an eye patch while his eye healed, and he remarked on how he looked like a pirate. Remarkably, he refused to be sent home, stating that he only needed one good eye to aim a rifle. Quickly, he returned to the front line and continued to act as a scout and sniper for his unit. Shortly after returning to active service in October 1944, he was involved in the month-long Battle of the Scheldt in Holland, which involved much heavy fighting and several amphibious landings. One day during this prolonged battle, Leo's commanding officer had ordered him to find the 50 zombies who had gone missing on patrol earlier. Zombie was a slang term used by Canadian volunteers for unenthusiastic, inexperienced Canadian conscripts in the war. Leo was carrying out the reconnaissance by himself, as always wearing PT sneakers instead of heavy boots. He was deep behind enemy lines, in the dark, in freezing cold rain, muttering to himself, "I am frozen and wet because of you, so you will pay." Drenched to the skin while not finding the zombies, he did come across a garrison of German regular troops, sleeping in trenches that they had been digging all day. Noticing a snoring German officer, Leo woke him up, pointing his Sten gun at him, and then motioned him to order his men to follow him. One soldier raised his rifle and was shot dead by Leo, followed by 3 others who joined the firefight. After this, he shouted, "Achtung!" and "Handen hoch!" and the garrison quickly decided to surrender to him. He then single-handedly marched 93 German soldiers back to the Allied lines. But on the way there, they were attacked by Waffen-SS troops manning an artillery battery from a neighboring village, who were infuriated that their fellow countrymen were surrendering. This left a lasting impression on Leo. The Waffen-SS unit managed to kill and injure a number of the German prisoners before being driven off by an Allied Sherman tank. Leo then handed over 93 German prisoners to his speechless commander. For his act of bravery, Leo was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, which is the second highest award in the British and Commonwealth, the Victoria Cross being the only one higher. But surprisingly, he declined the medal, feeling the British commander, General Montgomery, who was going to present him with the award, was incompetent and therefore in no position to give him that medal. Then in February 1945, as his unit was fighting in the Rhineland in Germany, the Bren gun carrier he was traveling in hit a mine, wrecking the vehicle and killing all its occupants, except Leo. He was severely injured, including 2 badly broken ankles, 4 ribs, and his back in 3 places. Leo again refused to be shipped back home, and after a short spell in a Belgian hospital, he returned to his unit in time for their final attack to clear Holland of the last of its German occupiers. So, on April 13, 1945, the Allies were preparing to attack the large Dutch town of Zwolle, but were unsure of the strength or deployment of the German forces in the town. That evening, Leo and his friend Corporal Willie Arsenault volunteered to carry out a recon of the area. The city was planned to be bombed by Allied artillery, and this is something Leo and Willie wanted to prevent. When the two approached the outskirts of the silent town, the Germans spotted Willie after his grenade bag made a rattling noise, and he was killed by enemy machine gun fire. Leo took 2 of them out, but the others fled in a vehicle. He then took his friend's Sten gun, an extra bag of grenades, then laid his lifeless body on the side. So enraged was Leo that he would go on a one-man rampage that lasted the whole night, using his submachine gun and bags full of grenades. He hijacked a nearby German scout car, disarming the driver and taking his MP-40, adding a 3rd submachine gun to his inventory. Leo made him drive to a hotel, then entered a bar. There he disarmed a German officer who could speak French to Leo, and he made him aware that the town was to be bombed by Canadian artillery, which would result in German military and civilian casualties. The officer understood, and in good faith, Leo handed him back his pistol, allowing him to drive off in the hopes that he would evacuate his troops rather than rally an attack. Leo moved around the town for a few hours in the dead of night, firing on any German units he came up against, throwing grenades and making as much noise around town as possible. His idea was to confuse the enemy into believing that they were under attack by a far larger Allied force storming the city. He proceeded in killing or capturing German defenders as he moved from street to street, using the local river and church as reference points so as not to get lost. Every time he had enough prisoners, normally between 8 to 10, he would march them back to the Allied lines and drop them off, before returning to the town to carry on his one-man assault. He is reckoned to have done this around 10 times. 4 times in the night he had to force his way into civilian houses to rest. Although terrified by his initial appearance, once they understood he was Canadian, they looked after Leo. During his rampage, he also attacked and set light to the Gestapo headquarters, further adding to the confusion. Then, finding the SS headquarters, he engaged in a firefight, killing 4 SS officers inside. Then, later, Leo came across a group of townsmen by chance. This included a local policeman by the name of Frit Kuiper. All of these men were secretly members of the Dutch resistance. Leo then explained to them that the town was liberated. Then the group went on to take the town hall and bring the civilians out onto the streets. By 4:30 a.m., the German garrison had fled the town, and Leo had single-handedly liberated Zwolle. Leo retrieved his friend Willie Arsenault's body and returned to his unit, who had yet to advance into the town. On that morning of April 14th, the Allied forces entered the town without a shot being fired and without the loss of civilian life from the planned bombardment, due to Leo's outstanding bravery the previous night. For his heroism above and beyond the call of duty, he was again awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, and this time he accepted it. After the war, Leo left the army and returned to civilian life to resume his old job as a pipe fitter. With the start of the Korean War in 1950, the Canadian Army joined the United Nations forces in fighting the Communist Chinese and North Korean invasion of South Korea. Leo, though only 29 years old, was seen as a veteran with a special skill set and was recruited to rejoin the army and become a member of a special scout and sniper team. Then, in November 1951, the Communists attempted to take some strategic important high ground just 40 miles away from Seoul, the South Korean capital. The fighting was based around the vitally important Hill 355, nicknamed Little Gibraltar, and Hill 277. Chinese troops had captured it from the Americans, and Leo was to recapture and hold the hill. The fighting raged for days, and the Canadian commander, Lieutenant Colonel Jacques Dextraz, declared, "In the event the battalion is attacked, there will be no withdrawal, no platoons overrun, and no panics." During the battle, Leo commanded a unit of around 18 men, repelling whole Chinese divisions while enduring heavy artillery and mortar barrages for 3 days. Even though Leo had been ordered to retreat when the Chinese divisions counterattacked, he refused. Instead, he demanded that the commander of the mortar platoon, Captain Charlie Forbes, rain mortar fire on the enemy. The mortar fire was so close to Leo's position that the commander could hear the bombs explode when Leo spoke on his radio, and it was so intense that the mortar barrels warped from their rate of fire. For his valor and leadership under fire, Leo was awarded another Distinguished Conduct Medal for capturing and holding the key hill. Leo was the only Canadian to win the Distinguished Conduct Medal in 2 separate wars. He lived a quiet life afterwards, and in 2008, at the age of 87, passed away, having been married for 57 years and having 4 children. Douglas Bader, the flying ace with no legs. Douglas Bader was a pilot in the Royal Air Force who would go on to pilot fighter planes in the Second World War without his legs and claimed 22 aerial victories, becoming a flying ace. Bader joined the RAF in 1928 and graduated in 1930, and in late 1931, at age 21, he was assigned to a squadron flying Bristol Bulldogs at Woodley Airfield near Reading. While flying the Bulldog, he went against orders not to do aerial acrobatics or fly below 2,000 feet. Nevertheless, Bader performed an aerial stunt to show off his skill, resulting in his plane crashing. Both of his legs were crushed under the twisted wood, canvas, and metal, with no way of saving them. They had to be amputated, one above the knee and one below. After this, Bader had to learn to walk again using artificial legs. Doctors were not hopeful that he would be able to walk without a stick, but Bader was determined, and he wanted to fly again. After being transferred to RAF Hospital Uxbridge, Bader learned new skills with his new legs. He learned to drive a racing car, play golf, tennis, and dance. During this time, he also met his future wife, Thelma. From 1937 to 1939, with World War II on the horizon, Bader requested several times to rejoin the RAF, but was refused piloting roles on the grounds that there was no incorporating his disability. Air Vice Marshal Hallahan recommended that Bader do the Central Flying School to test his abilities, which he passed. This would also familiarize himself with the newer, modern planes. Bader noticed how the planes had upgraded significantly. Gone were the biplanes, replaced with new low-wing monoplanes such as the Hurricane and the Spitfire. While in his Avro Tudor during the training, Bader couldn't resist doing a stunt, turning his biplane upside down at 600 feet. By 1940, Bader would be posted to the No. 19 Squadron and put in a cockpit of a Spitfire, undertaking convoy patrol missions. During this time, known as the Phony War, he wouldn't see much action, but soon he would be posted to No. 222 Squadron, where he would see action over Dunkirk during the Battle of France, protecting the Royal Navy and evacuating the British Army below from the Luftwaffe. During this combat, he took down a Messerschmitt Bf-109 and damaged a Heinkel HE-111 bomber. Bader noticed that his disability gave him a distinct advantage when piloting his plane during dogfights. Because he didn't have legs, he was less likely to black out from the effects of G-force. Usually, this would cause blood to flow from the brain to other parts of the body, such as the legs, causing loss of consciousness. This meant that Bader could pull off tight turns and outmaneuver his opponents. After Dunkirk, Bader was transferred to No. 242 Squadron and promoted to squadron leader. This squadron, which was made up of Canadians, was low on morale due to heavy casualties during the Battle of France. At first, they were not welcoming to their new leader and were puzzled by his disability, but he would soon rebuild the squadron's morale and inspire them with his courage and skill. They would fight in the Battle of Britain and see major action on the 30th of August 1940, when the squadron took down 12 enemy planes, 2 of which were shot down by Bader.
By the end of 1940, with the Battle of Britain over, No. 242 Squadron had shot down 67 enemy aircraft, with 5 pilots killed in action. Barter would leave the squadron in March 1941. He was promoted to wing commander and leader, escorting bombers during daylight raids at a Spitfire Mark 5A as part of the circus operations. Taking on enemy Bf-109s with his squadron, sometimes at dangerously low heights, his score would rise to 20 confirmed as destroyed plus 2 shared. On August 8th, Barter noticed a formation of 12 enemy fighters and dived on them, taking out one and possibly colliding with another Bf-109 or shot down by it, sending his Spitfire diving into the ground in flames. While trying to bail out, one of Barter's artificial legs became stuck. However, he was able to escape from the cockpit just in time. When he landed, he was captured by the Germans and taken to a hospital in St. Omer as a prisoner of war. The Germans had great respect for Barter because of his courage to fly without legs. Flying ace Adolf Galland asked the British to airdrop Barter a replacement leg, which they did. Shortly afterwards, Barter tried to escape the hospital using a rope made from bed sheets so that he could climb down from the window. He was eventually caught, however, after being betrayed. Barter was now on a Luftwaffe-run prisoner of war camp known as Stalag Luft III. He had made so many escape attempts that the Germans guarding the camp threatened to take away his artificial legs. In 1942, while in Stalag Luft 8B, Barter and several others tried to escape, but the alarm was raised when a Luftwaffe officer came to visit Barter and he was not there. Soon, he was recaptured. He was then transferred to the escape-proof Colditz Castle on the 18th of August 1942, where he would spend the rest of the war. And on April 15, 1945, the prison was liberated, and Barter was freed by American troops.
Lowry Thorne, the soldier of 3 armies. It was October 18, 1965. The outdated South Vietnam Air Force H-34 helicopter hugged tightly to the mountainous terrain of the Phuoc Son district of Vietnam. As the French and Americans had found, this reliable but old workhorse was not well suited for frontline combat duty due to its slow speed and large silhouette. But maybe most significantly of all, its magnesium skin was prone to very intense and deadly fires if hit. Despite their best efforts, rescue teams could not locate the downed helicopter and its crew, or the Special Forces soldiers on board. It was not until over 30 years later that the crash site of the helicopter was found. It was concluded that the helicopter had crashed into the side of a mountain while flying nap of the earth. Among the remains retrieved at the site was that of an American officer who was the team leader of the mission. He was Captain Larry Thorne, a U.S. military advisor who had also been in World War II, a commander in the German Waffen-SS, and a Finnish Army First Lieutenant. He was a highly decorated soldier, and his awards included the German Iron Cross, Second Class, an American Legion of Merit Medal, and the highest of Finnish awards, the Mannerheim Cross. Who was this man? Well, he wasn't originally an American, nor was his name Larry Thorne. In fact, his real name was Lauri Thorne, and he was born in Viipuri, Finland on May 28, 1919. Just 2 years before his birth, the Russian Empire had collapsed, allowing Finland to emerge as a new independent nation. Lauri's hometown found itself on the very border with the Soviet Union, and over the next 2 decades, the Soviet Union became more and more interested in annexing Finland. In 1938, Lauri joined the Finnish 4th Independent Jaeger Infantry Battalion at the age of 19. This wasn't an ordinary unit. It was a CC unit who were experts at sabotage and guerrilla warfare, as well as long-range reconnaissance. They were often considered an elite unit, and their job was to penetrate deep behind enemy lines, often gathering intelligence, operating from concealed positions. Sometimes they would carry out roadside ambushes, even being used to hunt down and destroy enemy special forces. He would soon need these skills, as just a year later in 1939, the Soviet Union carried out an unprovoked attack on Finland called the Winter War. Fighting in the Finnish army. Lauri's battalion was based at Kiviniemi when the war started, tasked with protecting the strategically important Leningrad-Kitola railroad line. Once it was realized that the Red Army was pouring over the Finnish-Soviet border, Lauri's battalion redeployed and moved forward to defend the massive lake at Ladoga. The lake was the largest in Europe and had been shared by the Finnish and the Soviet Union since 1918 and had always been an area of high tension between the two nations. The Red Army attacked the area with overwhelming numbers, but they were ill-equipped, lacking adequate winter equipment. Their tanks were also still painted olive green, and their infantry were still wearing brown coats as their camouflage winter clothing had yet to arrive. Lowry's battalion pushed back and surrounded a large number of Red Army troops at Lemeti on the northern part of the lake. Both Lowry's battalion and the winter weather in the form of frostbite inflicted huge casualties on the Red Army divisions encircled there. Lowry took command of the defense of Sugarloaf Hill, a hill that had to be held against the enemy forces in order to maintain Finnish reinforcements. The Finnish headquarters couldn't contact the defenders, so Lowry, using his skis, stealthily moved past the Soviet positions, re-establishing communications. Lowry then took command of a group of demoralized Swedish-speaking Finns, defending a key position, conveying orders through gestures, shouting, and punches because he didn't speak Swedish. Lowry's courageous performance during this engagement came to the attention of his commanding officers, and he was promoted to second lieutenant. But it was ultimately to no avail, for it was a short and bloody war, lasting just over 100 days. In the end, Finland was forced to concede 11% of its territory, but it was a hollow victory for the Soviet Union. They were thrown out of the League of Nations. Their casualties had been truly staggering, and many, including Adolf Hitler, now viewed the Soviet armed forces as a weak and ineffective force. In June 1941, Lowry went to train with the Waffen-SS in Austria for 7 weeks to gain further specialist skills, as by now Nazi Germany was a strong ally of Finland. During training, he wore a Waffen-SS uniform and was given the rank of Untersturmführer, or Junior Storm Leader. Ignorant of the political implications, his swearing of the oath of loyalty even after death would later haunt him in the years to come. Much to Lowry's distress, his hometown was now on the Soviet side of the border, as was the whole Lake Ladoga region he had fought so hard to protect. Even his barracks at Kiviniemi were all now in Soviet hands. On June 22, 1941, the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, the surprise attack on the Soviet Union. 3 days later, the Finnish attacked too, in what became known as the Continuation War. Lowry was back in Finland, put in charge of an armored unit consisting of captured Soviet tanks and armored cars. Finland would not take part in Germany's road to conquest, only advancing as far as its previous territories lost during the Winter War. On March 23, 1942, Lowry was skiing behind enemy lines when he skied over a friendly shrapnel mine while trying to capture enemy prisoners. He was hospitalized but eventually recovered, and instead of going on home leave, he went AWOL, back to the front. By this time, the conflict had fallen into static trench-style warfare, and Lowry's unit was tasked with counter-guerrilla and counter-reconnaissance against Soviet special units that were behind enemy lines. Later, this would move into aggressive actions as they infiltrated behind Soviet lines themselves, taking on Red Army headquarters and communication sites. Lowry impressed his superiors, and in January 1943, he was given the chance by his senior officers to take command of a deep strike infantry unit that later became known as Detachment Thorne. With the promise of better rations and more active combat during what had become trench warfare, he received countless keen volunteers. With a strict criteria for aggressiveness, physical stamina, and good marksmanship, he rejected those that were unfit and picked the best men. They would take part in sabotage, capturing prisoners, and intelligence gathering behind Soviet lines. In one mission, Lowry's unit used rowing boats to get into place. They ambushed a Soviet truck and obtained a bag of intel. Then, when a second truck came out of nowhere, moved into close combat using puko knives and axes. More Red Army troops reinforced the position, and Lowry's raiders escaped into the forest, stealthily sneaking past Soviet patrols, eventually making it back to the boats. Lowry had made sure that every man knew the enemy intel in case only one of them made it out alive. The unit would succeed in several hit-and-run skirmishes, operating from a base camp that was deep in Soviet territory. They also learned to use the enemy weapons, which created confusion during engagements and made ammo plentiful as they were operating deep in Red Army territory. Lowry and his men soon gained a formidable reputation for bravery and mayhem, to the extent that the Soviets put a bounty of 3 million Finnish marks on his head as they feared him so much. By June 1944, the war was all but lost for the Finnish. Despite victory after victory against the Soviet Union, they were simply too outnumbered. For his outstanding bravery and leadership during the battle, Lowry was awarded the Mannerheim Cross on July 9, 1944. In September 1944, the Finnish brokered the best deal it could with the Soviet Union, and in effect, the war ended. Most of the Finnish army was demobilizing, including Lowry, who was by now a captain. So by November 1944, Lowry found himself a civilian, unemployed, and his country forced into a humiliating armistice. Once again, they had to concede territory and pay the Soviet Union reparation. As well as this, key members of the Finnish War were put on trial. Fighting in the German army. Lowry joined the Finnish resistance, who formed in the event that the Soviets tried to completely occupy Finland. He went to Germany for training in early 1945 with the intention of returning to train the resistance, but ended up joining the German army. He had secretly boarded a U-boat and had taken the alias of Lowry Lane to hide the fact that he was involving himself with the Germans. During his training, the German front in the east collapsed and the Red Army were on the borders of Germany. With no ships left, Lowry couldn't return to Finland, so he figured he could fight the Soviets by joining a ragtag band of Germans and was given the rank of a captain. Lowry used the same tactics that he had used so successfully against the Soviets in Finland. He was also joined by a fellow Finn, an officer named Samu Korpela. Soon he had gained a reputation for bravery, and his men loyally followed him, even though his grasp of the German language was poor. By March 1945, the German army was defeated. Lowry and his men were fighting for their lives and decided to head west while they still could. This was to avoid the terrible fate of falling into the hands of the Red Army. After VE Day, Lowry and his men found themselves behind German lines. Once again, Lowry performed a remarkable feat. He led his unit into Western Germany, and he surrendered with his men to the British at Lubeck. By doing so, the Finn had saved himself and the men of his unit from years of captivity in Siberia. Lowry ended up being put in a prisoner of war camp in Lubeck, Germany. He feared that he would be turned over to the Soviets because of his role in the continuation war, or they would discover his involvement in the Waffen-SS. A few months later, in June 1945, he escaped the camp with Samu Korpela and made his way back to Finland. He was arrested, this time by the Finnish state police, but shortly escaped from them too. Lowry was then arrested again in June 1946 and tried for treason for joining the German army when Finland had signed a peace treaty with the Soviets. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. During his time in prison, he had made several escape attempts, which all ended in failure. His last one used a grappling hook made from bed sheets and scrap from the metal shop. He was finally pardoned by the Finnish president in December 1948 and released. Unhappy and disillusioned, Lowry went to Sweden in 1949 under the false name of Elino Morsky. He ended up in Venezuela and in 1950 found work on a Swedish cargo ship, the MS Skagen. A few months later, when it was off the coast of Alabama, he jumped ship and swam ashore. He was reduced to doing carpentry and cleaning jobs, and in 1953, he was granted a residence visa. Fighting in the U.S. Army. In 1954, at the age of 35, he joined the U.S. Army, adopting the name Larry Thorne. Even though he was a recruit, his experience stood out vastly compared to the other men. His natural leadership abilities gained him rapid promotion, and he was made a first lieutenant in 1957 and then a captain in 1960. He had been stationed in West Germany from 1958 to 1962. During this time, he got in trouble when he got into a bar fight. A fellow Finnish officer pulled some strings and he got Larry transferred to the 10th Special Forces Group. He was able to use his experience to teach skiing, survival, mountaineering, and guerrilla tactics, and learned new skills himself in airborne school. In January 1962, Larry was sent to the Zagros Mountains of Iran in command of his team, where he successfully completed his mission to destroy the top-secret material on a crashed U.S. plane. Then in 1963, he was sent to South Vietnam to assist in the formation of local CIDG units. In one particular vicious firefight at Tien Bien near the Cambodian border, he was awarded 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star for bravery. The Viet Cong attacked his base in force and breached the outer perimeter, almost overrunning the area. If it wasn't for his determination, the base would have been lost. It is said that in Robin Moore's book, The Green Berets, Captain Steve Corney is based on Larry Thorne. When he returned to the United States, instead of retiring to a desk job,
Larry volunteered for a second tour of duty. During his second tour of duty on October 18, 1965, Larry was put in command of a top-secret Special Forces unit called MAC-V-SOG, trying to locate Viet Cong turnaround points along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, when his helicopter crashed in the mountains and he was killed. His remains went undiscovered for over 30 years. Lowry earned the Distinguished Flying Cross and was promoted to Major posthumously. His name is honored on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., and in 2003 his remains were brought back to America. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. George H.W. Bush, the president who avoided being eaten by cannibals in World War II. George Herbert Walker Bush was the last U.S. president that served in combat. There were a number of his predecessors who also paid their debt to the country, but George Bush's experience was completely unique. He managed to evade the gruesome death of being eaten by Japanese soldiers. When the Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, George Bush was only a 17-year-old teenager. He was attending the last year of the Phillips Academy University Preparatory School in Andover, Massachusetts. In the days after the attack, the people of the United States experienced a rush of patriotism. It was the same case with young Bush, who wanted to enlist as soon as possible so he could serve his country. Since he was still underage, his first idea was to enlist in Canada, but he changed his mind due to his strong wish to serve as an aviator in the U.S. Navy. As soon as he graduated and turned 18 on June 13, 1942, George Bush signed up for the U.S. Naval Reserves. 1 year after he joined the Navy, he was commissioned as an ensign. Many believed at the time that he was the youngest pilot in the U.S. Navy, as he was only 19 years old. It didn't take long when in the spring of 1944 he was sent as a pilot to the USS San Jacinto light aircraft carrier. He arrived just in time to participate in the campaign of island hopping against Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Still a youngster, George Bush became an experienced pilot after fighting over Marcus and Wake Island. He also participated in one of the largest air combats in the war, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. In the final day of the battle after returning from the mission, Bush had to make a forced landing on the water. It was his first crash in the war. Luckily, he and his crew were rescued by the destroyer USS Clarence K. Bronson. The second one, however, was far more dramatic. As American forces were rolling northwards on the Pacific, they commenced a campaign on the Bonin Islands in August 1944. It was the same month when George H.W. Bush was promoted to Lieutenant Junior. On September 2nd, Bush received an order to fly in a group with 3 other bombers towards the island of Chichijima. Their mission was to destroy a very important radio tower that was located on the island. As soon as they appeared in the skies over the island, they were attacked by the strong anti-aircraft defense. Bush's plane was hit at the moment when he started to dive towards the target. Neglecting the fact that his plane was on fire and the entire cockpit was full of smoke, Bush continued to dive until he realized the bombs had hit and damaged the radio tower. It was only then that he turned his blazing plane towards the USS San Jacinto. Once they were far enough from the island, Bush and 2 other crew members bailed out of the plane. As he was descending, Bush observed his plane hitting the water and disappear into the waves. Moments after, as he hit the water, his struggle began. With a heavy, soaked flight suit, wounded head, and eyes still burning from the smoke in the cockpit, Bush had to fight to stay on top of the water. His fortune was that he landed in the vicinity of a life raft. When he got a hold of it, he inflated it and climbed aboard. The misfortune was that the winds were pushing him closer towards the Japanese-held island, so Bush had to paddle with his arms to stay as far away as possible. At one point, he was spotted by the Japanese, who sent boats to capture him, but these were repelled by American fighter planes. For 4 hours, George was floating in his raft as fighter aircraft were flying above his head to protect him. Finally, he was rescued by the lifeguard submarine, USS Finback. Several other airmen were shot down and also escaped by bailing out, but they would not be so lucky. Those 8 aviators who were captured suffered severe torture from the Japanese squad on the island. They were either beaten or stabbed with sharp bamboo sticks, after which they were killed. The most horrifying part was that the bodies of 4 of them were used to prepare a meal for the Japanese officers.
By the wish of Major Sueo Matoba, Japanese surgeon Dr. Teraki removed the liver from one of the dead U.S. pilots and handed it over to the cook. He then prepared it with soy sauce and vegetables and served it in small pieces pierced with bamboo sticks. Major Matoba, in the company of other officers, and commander of the island General Yoshio Tachibana, feasted on this gruesome meal with sake. They believed it was good medicine for the stomach. The same feast was repeated with the body parts of 3 of the other aviators. At the time, Bush knew nothing about this crime that was kept secret, even though the executors were eventually trialed in 1946. It was not until 2003, in the study published in the book Flyboys, A True Story of Courage, that George H.W. Bush and the entire public learned of the terrible destiny of the captured airmen. In November 1944, Bush returned to the USS San Jacinto and continued to fight over the Philippines. After a few months, his entire unit returned to the States due to heavy casualties. And in September 1945, George H.W. Bush was honorably discharged from duty. Even though he flew 58 combat missions, had 126 carrier landings, and 1,228 flight hours, the mission over the island of Chichijima was one that earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross. As he later claimed, these were the moments that he remembered for the rest of his life. The soldier who threw himself onto a grenade. Sergeant Major Osborne. Heroic sacrifice. Defense of Hong Kong, 1941. During the defense of Hong Kong, on the morning of December 19, 1941, a company of Winnipeg Grenadiers was separated during an attack on Mount Butler on Hong Kong Island. The company was led by Sergeant Major Osborne, full name John Robert Osborne. He was born in Fulton, Norfolk, England, and served in the First World War as part of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. After the war, he moved to Canada at Saskatchewan, Wapella, where he was a farmer for 2 years. He then moved to Winnipeg, Manitoba. After working for the Canadian Pacific Railway, he joined the Winnipeg Grenadiers in 1933. In September 1939, at the outbreak of World War II, the Winnipeg Grenadiers were called for duty, serving as a garrison in Jamaica. On October 27, 1941, the raw recruits of the Winnipeg Grenadiers sailed for Hong Kong under British orders to strengthen the garrison there in preparation for an impending Japanese invasion. Osborne was a company sergeant major for A Company in the 1st Battalion by now. On the morning of December 19, 1941, a part of the company of Winnipeg Grenadiers, led by Sergeant Major Osborne, made a bayonet charge on Mount Butler, capturing the steep hill. Holding out for 3 hours against Japanese counterattacks, soon the overwhelming enemy numbers opened an undefended flank. Osborne and his group prepared for withdrawal. While the group were rejoining with the company, he engaged the enemy single-handedly under heavy enemy rifle and machine gun fire while helping stragglers get to the new company position. Now it was afternoon, and the company found itself cut off from the battalion. The Canadians were now completely surrounded by enemy forces, who were so close that they were within grenade throwing distance. The position was hopeless. The Japanese soldiers threw several grenades into the Canadian position, but Osborne picked them up and threw them back to protect his fellow soldiers. But then, a grenade landed where it would be impossible to pick it up and throw in time. Osborne made a split-second decision. He shouted a warning, pushed a comrade out of the way, and threw himself onto the enemy grenade, which exploded and killed him instantly. He was 42 years old. This action saved the lives of his fellow comrades, desperately defending the position. The company maintained a defense against an overwhelming enemy for 8.5 hours, with 60 casualties and a few survivors taken as prisoners. Sergeant Major Osborne displayed the highest qualities of heroism and self-sacrifice, becoming the first Canadian to receive the Victoria Cross in the Second World War, which he received posthumously. He was also the only person to be awarded a Victoria Cross for the Battle of Hong Kong. He is memorialized by a plaque on a statue of an anonymous World War I soldier located in Hong Kong Park. The medic who fought a war without a weapon. Desmond Doss was not your average hero. He would become a Medal of Honor recipient, the United States of America's highest and most prestigious military award, as a combat medic who saved many of his comrades' lives in battle without firing a single shot. because he didn't take a weapon into combat because of his religious beliefs. Desmond Doss was born in 1919 in the state of Virginia and was raised as a strict Seventh-day Adventist, a Christian denomination that believed that Saturday was the Sabbath and that the second coming of Jesus Christ was imminent. They also believed strongly in nonviolence and a healthy diet, based typically on a vegetarian diet. Doss had been raised with a strict belief in the Bible, and when it came to the Ten Commandments, he took them to be the core values of how to lead his life. When World War II started, he was conflicted as he believed the war was a just one, but he felt that to kill another human being under any circumstance was wrong. He was already employed as a joiner at Newport News Naval Shipyard, but nevertheless he joined the United States Army on April 1, 1942. He could have requested a deferment, but he wanted to do his patriotic duty. He was assigned to an infantry unit, the 77th Division, and presumed that his classification as a conscientious objector would not require him to carry a weapon. For Doss, one commandment of the Bible stuck with him the most: "Thou shalt not kill." He wondered why he was assigned as a rifleman and not in a medical role. His commanding officer tried to pressure Doss into carrying a weapon as they thought he would be more of a liability than an asset in combat, but Doss refused. Interestingly, even for medics, which Doss would later become, it was common practice at the time to carry either an M1911A1 pistol or M1 carbine for self-defense purposes. The rules go that a medic under the Geneva Convention is not forbidden from carrying a weapon, but if a medic fires his weapon, he stops being classed as a medic, and therefore can be legitimately fired upon by the enemy. The regimental chaplain, Captain Stanley, would soon understand Doss's protests and helped him transfer from rifleman to medical training. To make matters worse, his fellow soldiers mocked his religious beliefs. When he was reading the Bible daily and strictly observing the Seventh-day Adventist tradition of attending church every Saturday, Doss continuously requested to be allowed to have Saturdays off rather than Sundays in order to follow his Adventist beliefs that Saturday was to be observed as the Sabbath. In the end, Captain Stanley took this up with divisional headquarters, and it was decided that Adventist soldiers would have Saturdays off, just as the other men had Sunday off. This in fact made Doss even more unpopular than ever with his fellow soldiers, as he was seen to have it easy. As he had Saturdays off, none were on base on Sundays to see him pull extra duties to make up for this. One of the squad's other soldiers summed up the company's feeling about him and his Saturdays off, complaining, "You get more passes than the general." As Doss was a strict vegetarian at a time when it was unusual, it meant that the rest of the unit viewed Doss with such distrust and hostility that one man in his unit even warned him ominously, "When we go into combat, Doss, you're not coming back alive. I'm going to shoot you myself." Doss eventually became an Army combat medic, saying, "While others are taking life, I will be saving it." The turning point for Doss and his relationship with his company came with their first 25-mile march with full field pack and rifle, something they were expected to achieve in 8 hours. The other soldiers thought Doss would be having it easy as he would be carrying no rifle or ammo that day, but his 2 canvas medical bags were almost as heavy and much more awkward to carry than any rifle. As the march progressed, the men started to suffer from exhaustion. Numerous blistered feet and dehydration, some even passed out. And all the time there was Doss, always with a helping hand, even to the extent that at the end of the march, he insisted on checking everyone's feet and administering medical aid where it was needed. By the end of that day, he had won the respect of his entire unit for his tireless devotion to his duty. For the first time, he was treated as one of their own. Doss, as the qualified combat medic of the unit, was now responsible for providing first aid and frontline trauma care on the battlefield. He would be assigned to accompany his unit into the war zone and be there with them on the front line at all times. This was soon to happen, for the 77th Division had had their first combat experience on May 11, 1943, and Doss and his comrades were urgently being trained up to replace the combat losses and help expand the division's strength. The 77th Division would end up being in combat officially for no less than 208 days, suffering a total of 9,212 casualties before the war would end. The Battle of Guam. Doss's first taste of combat was at the Battle of Guam, which was a bloody battle fought from July 21st to August 10, 1944, to recapture the U.S. territory of the island of Guam, from a determined Japanese garrison of nearly 20,000 troops. Though according to the Geneva Convention, knowingly firing at a medic wearing a clear insignia is a war crime, the Japanese snipers and machine gunners tended to ignore this and saw combat medics as easy and valuable targets to gun down. So medics in the Pacific Theater were often told to avoid wearing medical insignia in case it would make them more, not less, of a target. Doss was under fire nearly every day during the battle and was busy doing his part in saving lives. Guam had shown Doss how cruel war could be. As his unit was pushing forward through the jungle on their first day, a young, fresh-faced recruit spotted a fountain pen laying on the jungle floor and went to pick it up. Before anyone could warn him otherwise, a white phosphorus grenade exploded. The pen had been booby-trapped. The young man who had picked up the pen, his chest now a bloody mess, had blood pouring out of an open wound. Severe burns and sharp metal fragments covered his body, and he was going into shock. By some miracle, Doss managed to stabilize his condition, administering care and helping to evacuate him and 3 other soldiers who had been wounded by flying red-hot shrapnel. This was Doss's first taste of combat casualties. The U.S. casualties during the battle was truly appalling. Of the 59,000 U.S. troops who took part in the invasion, around every 1 in 6 were either killed or wounded. The Battle of Leyte. Next, Doss and his unit was involved in the Battle of Leyte in the Philippines that ran from October 17th to December 26, 1944. A vicious and prolonged battle which started with a huge U.S. coastal bombardment and amphibious landing, followed by heavy fighting the more inland the Americans went. During a Japanese counterattack, a fellow medic, Clarence Glenn, had heard the call for a medic from a machine gunner. He left the cover and went into the open, into no man's land, to get the wounded man, and was himself hit. Glenn was Doss's friend from back home and he couldn't leave him there. So he and a litter bearer, Herb Schechter, went out to find the 2 wounded and dealt with them separately. Doss was attending the machine gunner who had a gash along his face while bullets whizzed overhead. Both of the wounded were alive. They made an improvised litter out of a poncho and tree branches to get the wounded men back to the aid station, but his friend Glenn would die before he made it. From this point on, Doss would not look at the face of the men he was treating in case it was another friend. Sadly, his friend Herb would be shot and killed when he and Doss were carrying a litter as their silhouette exposed them against the sky to the enemy. On top of losing his friends, Doss was constantly hungry because the meat in the K rations conflicted with his vegetarianism, so he could only eat the tasteless crackers and coconuts he found. On Leyte, the coconuts on the ground gave him diarrhea, so he climbed the trees for fresh ones. At one point, Doss was looking for coconuts. It attracted poorly aimed Japanese machine gun fire. When they were killed by American soldiers, it was later discovered that they had been drunk on sake. One thing that shocked Doss during the most devastating times of the campaign was that the same man who had made threats towards him during training at Fort Jackson now came to him for guidance and to pray for him. The Battle of Okinawa. And lastly, for Doss and the 77th Infantry Division was a battle that was to be the bloodiest battle of the war in the Pacific, as well as its largest amphibious landing. The U.S. objective was to secure the island as a base, as it was just 350 miles south of the Japanese mainland and would be strategically crucial for any future invasion of Japan. The battle started on April 1st, 1945, exactly 3 years to the day that Doss first enlisted in the Army, and the battle was to last 81 days. Doss was assigned to the 1st Battalion as their combat medic. On April 29, 1945, the 77th Division was given the task of assaulting on a 400-foot-high cliff called the Maida Escarpment. This was nicknamed by the Americans as Hacksaw Ridge. Before they climbed the cargo net, Doss said a prayer for his comrades. When Doss's unit joined the assault, and as they neared the top of the escarpment, they came under intense Japanese artillery, small arms, and machine gun fire, inflicting severe casualties on the assaulting American troops. The American forces had sent in wave after wave of troops to try to dislodge a fanatical enemy base there who were well entrenched and camouflaged. On May 4th, while his unit was attacking a heavily fortified enemy position at the mouth of a cave, Doss went to the aid of 4 of his injured comrades. The lieutenant who led the attack on the emplacement had intended to throw a grenade when an enemy bullet hit him and delayed it. blowing his hand off and wounding his comrades. Despite having to get within 25 feet of the enemy lines and under attack by enemy grenades and gunfire, Doss managed to get to the injured men. He then managed to evacuate the men back to his own lines, one by one. During the night, the Japanese continued to throw grenades and kept up the mortar fire. The American soldiers hid in rock crevices, but the Japanese found ways to infiltrate and sneak up on them. Then, on the next day, May 5th, he came to the rescue of a wounded artillery officer who had gone to see how the artillery guns were doing. Doss's left leg was now injured, as he had fell the day before down the edge of a parapet. He climbed up the cargo net with his first aid kits, his weight falling on his bad leg. Finding him in a shell hole, the officer had been struck by shrapnel that had made a hole from his chest to his back, and Doss could hear him breathing through it. He was bleeding heavily. Doss gave him first aid while under constant enemy gunfire and shelling. He put the dressings over the large holes in the colonel's chest and back, and administered blood plasma which dangerously exposed Doss to the enemy, as he had to hold it up high. Doss's efforts here would be in vain, as the colonel, carried back on a stretcher, died before he reached the aid station. Later, there were orders to take a vital Japanese pillbox position on the reverse slope of a hill that was holding up the American advance. Desmond Doss, once he had read his prayers, was happy to support the assault. The American troops threw gasoline cans at the position, which triggered a large explosion. All of a sudden, a large Japanese counterattack overwhelmed the American soldiers, causing them to panic and rush back to the edge of the cliff. But despite this, Doss refused to take cover, and while constantly under heavy fire by the enemy, though being totally exhausted, he spent hours carrying the wounded one by one to the edge of the escarpment. Then, to get the more severely wounded down, he tied a rope to a tree stump and lowered them down the cliff on a rope-supported stretcher to safety. When the stretcher kept slipping, he turned to a new method, looping the rope around the wounded men's chest and legs to lower them down. Doss, standing, exposed to potential enemy fire, was seen praying at the cliff edge as the men were being lowered down. And later he had said he had been praying to the Lord to help him get one more, and after that, one more, until they were all down. Calculating the wounded men at the base of the cliff, the captain worked out that Doss had saved around 75 men. The Americans would eventually go back up the cliff and on May 7th would take the position. By some miracle, Doss survived the whole battle totally unhurt, but that was soon to change. On May 21st, in the confusion of a night attack, Doss tended to the American wounded, risking being hit by both the Japanese and by friendly fire. Doss was in a shell hole with another American soldier when a grenade landed beneath him. His reflex action was to put his foot on it and was seriously wounded in both legs, as blood poured out from the impact of 17 pieces of shrapnel in his body. But he remained in his position for 5 hours, tending to himself while also helping others who were wounded, until a medic and a pair of litter bearers could get to him. But that was not the end of it that day, for as he was being stretchered to safety, they got caught in an enemy tank attack. As they took cover, Doss spotted a critically injured man and insisted that he be taken back on the stretcher instead of himself. While Doss waited for the litter bearers to return, he was found and helped back by a fellow soldier. Suddenly, Doss was hit by a Japanese sniper's bullet and suffered a compound fracture to his arm. The two men took cover in a shell hole. Realizing how badly injured he now was, Doss instructed the soldier on how to bind his rifle stock to his shattered arm to act as a splint. Eventually pushing through excruciating pain, he would make it back to the aid station. The U.S. Army recognized Doss's extreme bravery, and he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroic and selfless actions at Okinawa from April 29th to May 21st, 1945. Because of his heroic actions, many wounded men made it back home. Desmond Doss would go on to run a small family farm with his wife Dorothy, and lived to the age of 87. Hey guys, check out this Simple History merch on Teespring. There's t-shirts, mugs, stickers, phone cases, and much more. Link in the description below.